Thank you very much, Rachel, for your introductory words. I also would like to acknowledge and thank His Excellency Abdullah bin Sultan bin Ahmed Al Nawawi for his opening address and his visionary comments this morning. I was honoured to be invited to give this short address, and I wish to thank Ms Linda Fitzalan, the remarkable and insightful Chief Executive Officer of the ADGM Courts, for her vision in creating such an interesting agenda. I hope that my address lends credence to the vision of this conference, namely to push the boundaries of conventional thinking and shape the next era of transformation and growth for the global legal community. Well, if you look at the topic, like me, it gets you thinking. And I asked myself, what forces have shifted in 20 years that now should make us think that in a major corporate reconstruction, probably cross-border, that we could or should be deploying new skills to achieve more certain beneficial outcomes? Is there a need for a paradigm shift, or is the status quo just fine? Let me take you back to my early days as a practicing lawyer acting for domestic and foreign banks chasing debtors into insolvency. The typical scenario was relatively simple. Banks lent money, a borrower defaulted. The banks were secured and exercised their rights under their security documents, and unsecured creditors, well, they just did and just hoped for the best. No one really cared about the implications on banks' reputations, the impact on staff and customers, the impact on communities, other third parties. Governments stood by because no one really expected them then to step in. There were casualties everywhere. Perhaps starting 20 years ago, that began to change. Banks were less keen on unilaterally exercising creditor rights. They understood that the media was not always sympathetic to their cause. In agriculture, they backed away from selling up farmers. In consumer areas, they sensed shifting winds. New legislation was introduced to protect the vulnerable. Class actions were looming, and public interest advocacy centres were carefully scrutinising contractual documentation for disclosure and fees. Concurrently, the regulators recognised they had powers and muscle, and they decided to use them. Parliament realised they could empower regulators more, and hey, there's no votes to be lost in bank bashing, particularly when interest rates are high and the citizens are unhappy with cost of living pressures. And in some jurisdictions, hauling bankers before Parliament to answer questions was and continues to be pure theatre. In the face of those challenges, banks have variously tightened lending standards, sold down debt, or worked through in more constructive ways how to deal with borrowers' financial distress and impairments. Specialist insolvency firms such as those represented here today have emerged. In more recent years, there's also been a growing expectation that in various insolvency scenarios, the government needs to step up. Perhaps that's just a reflection of the role they increasingly play in society, from dealing with pandemics to climate. So at least in Australia, we've seen in recent months governments this year step in to save parts of an airline business so it could continue to service regional communities. Walking side by side with these developments has been the emerging school of thought relating to a company's social licence to operate, sometimes abbreviated to SLO. It's not a new concept, and some academics suggest that it had its inception in the mining industry in the 1990s before being taken up in other contexts. Now, there's quite a deal of controversy in legal circles as to the meaning and scope of the description. I'm not here today to debate that aspect, but it's a terrific topic for another day. Rather, I wanted to spend the remaining few minutes discussing how it operates and why it might be relevant to us today. First of all, what do we mean by it? It may not surprise you, but there is no clear definition. Much depends on the debate as to whether companies exist to serve the interests of their shareholders or are obliged, sometimes legally, and I would say always reputationally, to take account of stakeholder and societal interests. What seems to be a common element of the principle is a recognition of the relationship between the corporation and a community of stakeholders. One of the speakers here this week, and you may have seen him yesterday on video, Larry Fink, writing in 2018, said that companies that lack a sense of purpose will lose the license to operate from key stakeholders. So quite a shift. When I was at law school, there was a real focus, and I'm sure for those of you who are as old as I am, we all focused on shareholders. And I think there's been a transformational change in that regard in the last 15, 20 years. So my question is, with the shift in societal expectations, how does or should that play out in a complex corporate insolvency reconstruction? Does it really matter? And if so, in what way? Colleagues with whom I speak and who practice exclusively in this field will confirm that to effect a broad-ranging, complex and often cross-border insolvency reorganisation does require buy-in from many, many stakeholders. In dispute resolution, typically associated with adversarial contests in domestic courts or arbitration, we're now all accustomed to the role of mediation. The independent appointment of a person to facilitate discussions, explore options, test with parties the strengths of their case, and potentially bring about a settlement of the adversarial contest. In the world of energy transition and resources, my own discussions with global corporations has elicited a real interest in an independent, neutral person facilitating the restructuring of current, unviable, long-term commercial arrangements. So, for example, a mining joint venture in, let's say, Africa may have been established a decade ago. Since then, operating costs of the mine have risen exponentially. The cost of capital has increased. Market prices and volumes for the mine product may have been flat or declining. Governments want increased taxes, and you will have seen what happened in Mali in the last few weeks there in respect of taxation by the government and imprisonment of officers of mining companies. And environmentalists are often opposed to expansion of any mine facilities. Conceptually, there should be a real interest in having an independent, neutral person facilitate discussions with all the relevant stakeholders. And indeed, a global miner said to me a few months ago, you know, it's very difficult for us to be the one driving this multi-party negotiation, walking into a room with our baseball cap on and the company logo and trying to lead the discussion. There is an opportunity for an independent, neutral person to drive this. And so in an insolvency reconstruction, there are, I suggest, strong similarities. There are lenders, not generally all pari passu, customers, employees, suppliers, contractors, governments often at different levels, trade unions, environmentalists and pension funds. As we will discuss shortly, we are seeing creditors exercise violence on violence against other creditors in liability management exercises. And I know you can't wait to hear about that. Overarchingly, all parties have their own discrete interest, but will recognise the fragility of the situation. Time is usually of the essence. In those circumstances, or ahead of their crystallisation, there may be an opportunity to craft a deal with all relevant parties, but to do so will require the usual negotiating tug-of-war and typically concessions by all parties of their own commercial interests, and I suggest a recognition that they are faced with their own discrete social licence to operate. The negotiators will have to coalesce divergent views of many, but a negotiation led by one party with a tangible commercial interest may be problematic. Other participants are likely to be suspicious, aware of bias or conflict, and the upshot may be the reconstruction fails when it should not have. It is in that context that I think the parties might, or should at least, consider a different negotiating process through an independent, neutral facilitator, where greater buy-in might deliver a successful outcome. The mechanics of an independently chaired facilitation will be bespoke to the situation, but using a mediation agreement as the cornerstone will be helpful, particularly as it deals with the structure of the meetings on a without prejudice basis, with confidentiality obligations, and agreements that nothing said can be used later in court against others. It also permits all relevant stakeholders to come to the table and discuss their needs and objectives. Finding a solution that all relevant parties buy into, whether fully satisfied or not, will likely lead to a comprehensive and long-term resolution, a much better result than having an adjudicator make a determination based solely on the law, leaving many stakeholders in the cold. So my parting thoughts for all of us here today as advisors to any of the stakeholders I have referenced: when market forces turn against your clients and financial adversity strikes, think of the opportunity to appoint an independent neutral facilitator to work with the key stakeholders to explore constructively and in a timely way the avenues for resolution. For law reformers, my message is to consider the simple but effective amendments to legislation to provide a platform for key stakeholders to be invited to consider a potential resolution under an independent chair within a reasonable timeframe. Thank you.